Another week, some more allegations, as we like to say here on the channel. It's just been abundant recently. This is the internet after all, so what's really new? Before we get into the story at hand, I think it's incredibly important to mention that the events laid out in this document occurred a year to a few years ago. These individuals were minors, and even now they still are relatively young, with Florescent themselves currently being 18, at least according to a quick Google search. And these details are important because it shifts the dynamic here and offers a bit of an explanation to the behaviors exhibited by each party. In this video, I'll try to summarize the documents relatively concisely. If you want to watch a full breakdown, check the link in the description. This all begins with a document that was published, in my opinion, quite rashly on May 17, 2025 in the midnight hours, at least if you live in the United States. It lays out that this is a third party bringing forward an anonymous individual story who is under the pseudonym Brick. It lays out how they knew of Brick and Ava, aka Florescent, personally, a bit of their behavior, and accused them of being a quote-unquote vile character in her own right. They also mention that this information, for the most part, will not have a lot of substantiation because the alleged victim is still coming out with more evidence, which only serves to make people extremely skeptical of the story off rip, which is a criticism I gave. However, there is a bit more to this. The first document explains that Brick and Ava had some interactions that were in fact consensual, except for one. As the story goes, apparently Brick and Ava were talking about going to see each other for a few days, with Ava stating that she only wanted to see Brick only if they were to have. Brick was somewhat reluctant but agreed to those conditions and visited Ava because Brick wanted to see her. Upon seeing each other on January 2nd through 3rd of 2024, they would engage in consensual, which Brick alleges left her bleeding and embarrassed. A detail in the story that stands out: Ava didn't want Brick to know her location, so Ava allegedly locked Brick's phone to prevent her from finding out where Ava lived. Brick woke up with her mom calling her to go home, however unable, as she couldn't Uber herself home. At this time, Ava had allegedly been asking Brick to have sex with her again, but Brick denied the request as she was still bleeding and in pain from the night before. Allegedly, Ava had continued to make these advancements, telling Brick that she would regret it if they didn't. Brick continuing to say no, only for Ava to end up on top of her, reaching into her pants. It states in the first document that apparently Brick kept rejecting the advances. However, because she felt helpless and couldn't call her mom unless she called her first, she eventually gave in without verbal consent being given. Then we have these message screenshots to corroborate the story somewhat, where Brick expresses her disappointment, how she did not want to have just sex, how she felt like she was being made jealous and being baited for a reaction, and that she wanted to be loved purely and not be used for her body or appearance, expressing that she just wanted to talk normally with Ava. That's a brief breakdown of the first document. However, we have another document that dropped 10 to 11 hours later that provides more examples of Ava's behavior and interactions with Brick and other people. Also, if you made it this far into the video, I am not suggesting that there is or isn't any validity to the claims being laid out here at all, but there will be more to explain as we move on into the story. I also have to reiterate, when it comes to teenagers such as these that are very inexperienced and are potentially still stuck with bad behavioral patterns or habits, there are nuances here to understand, such as, is this person intentionally malicious, or is this some sort of instinctual behavior that they could grow out of? Of course, that doesn't make the behavior any better or correct in any way, shape, or form. It doesn't make this right or wrong at all, but I can already see that there are going to be instances where people are going to see this at face value and jump to the worst possible judgment or condemnation. So let's move on to the second document. This document, as far as we know, was in fact written by the alleged victim. According to this first paragraph, Brick attempted to make a police report asking Ava when she'd be back into Toronto so that she could, only to be blocked shortly after. And to be clear, this doesn't mean that a crime was or wasn't committed, or that a police report was in fact filed or not. The second paragraph explains they were both teenagers when this relationship began, the relationship beginning in December, ending around early October, roughly 9 months. The relationship was apparently very toxic, abusive, and controlling. Apparently Ava, 16 at the time, had cheated on Brick with a 20-year-old, in which Brick would attempt to break up with Ava, but Ava would call Brick's mom, crying, begging to talk to Brick. All of these things made leaving Ava very difficult, she says, as it was her first relationship ever, and she was a quote-unquote very socially inexperienced 15-year-old. So we already have a very rough understanding of the dynamics at play here. Two very emotionally underdeveloped teenagers, with one potentially being emotionally manipulative. We do get more glimpses into the dynamics of this relationship though as we go through their DMs as well. Going through the DMs, we see Brick confronting Ava, taking the screenshots of the DM she sent to her friend, to Ava expressing her discomfort, with Ava attempting to deflect from this confrontation, saying she was sleepy throughout the event. Brick gets irritated at the fact that Ava is attempting to deflect, stating that she doesn't know if that's how things happened, even acknowledging it doesn't justify it. Ava states they both did things they liked, that she tried giving her the best treatment even she could. Brick shoots back with, I'm telling you for 30 minutes I need to go home. Her phone is locked and can't Uber. Ava saying she really tried. Sorry it didn't work out. Brick says Ava was a good girlfriend. Wouldn't miss Ava if she wasn't, but their relationship was too revolving around interactions. Then we see here how Brick is in fact attempting to report this. Then in the last messages, we see that Brick is attempting to get closure, disappointed that she can't because Ava doesn't remember the events. Ava stating she doesn't want to discredit Brick, make her feel ashamed or wrong, but what Ava remembers is completely different. Ava in the next messages further states that she doesn't want to shoot Brick down, acknowledging they're in a bad place, saying she does feel horrible for Brick and what she's going through, stating again that she doesn't believe that's how that interaction went down. Ava sympathizes but doesn't believe Brick. To be clear, from these messages, all that we can gather is that this interaction is very she said, but it's incredibly difficult to actually pinpoint whether or not something non-consensual occurred. However, these DMs do corroborate that something in fact did occur. It's just difficult to really put a finger on something when approaching this fairly and in good faith. You are free to come to your own conclusions on this. I, however, am playing it very safe. There is something here that in my opinion can be chalked up to a misunderstanding, such as this part right here with the pregnancy story. Apparently, Brick had mistook some stomach illness as early signs of pregnancy at the time, then had taken a pregnancy test which came out positive. She panicked, took an image from Google that was quote-unquote very obviously not Brick's to gauge Ava's reaction. Apparently, Brick meant it as a joke. She then later took more tests, which came out negative. According to Brick, though, Ava came at her a few weeks later, blaming her for many things because Brick lied about being pregnant, which resulted in Ava being stressed out during practice. According to Brick, Ava claimed Brick lied about being pregnant, which Brick states she clarified that she wasn't, but Ava turned it on her, claiming Brick was coping. This part right here, I'm not going to paraphrase, so you can take it as you will. I truly cannot stress this enough, but even after this whole fight, she still refused to have protected sex. I would ask her to use protection because I was terrified of getting pregnant, but despite my concerns, she would continue to refuse and ignore my well-being and worries. Now, does this prove anything? Honestly, it's quite difficult to say. From the perspective of Brick, the story could go either way. Brick shouldn't have acted rashly in the first place and attempted to gauge a reaction like that. That was incredibly irresponsible and could have been interpreted in many ways. Ava could have reasonably interpreted this quite negatively. However, if it is true that Ava didn't take any precautions in the future to prevent a legitimate issue like this again, then there is something to criticize here. However, there really isn't anything here to substantiate the story or to really measure the rights or wrongs here, so take that with a grain of salt if you want to. This next part of the document I'm not going to rehash because it's incredibly redundant and goes over the initial allegations that we went through, but I will go over some of the attached DMs. However, take a moment to read this if you want to. Let's look at this exchange for example. Brick calls Ava bro, in which Ava responds, I'm just bro to you. Brick says, yeah, we're just friends. Then Ava says, okay bro, I'm not seeing you tomorrow. Brick says, you can't do that, I need you. Ava says, no, I'm just bro, not even M-word. You don't even love me. Which is funny and not to think about when you look into previous messages where Ava states she doesn't want to be in a relationship or catch up and talk. They made their interest pretty clear with being no strings attached. We also see Ava saying, I thought you did love me still, reiterating that she misses Brick but doesn't want a relationship. Then in a later message exchange, we have this interaction and at the end she says, I hope you'll stay loyal to me until I'm ready. It's player behavior, and in my opinion also manipulative, which I find pretty gross, very gross, and off-putting, which is where we can more so start really gauging Ava's behavior. There's this part of this document as well, where Brick says before the CNE event, which is the Canadian National Exhibition to be clear, they had decided to go despite being broken up to not waste tickets. According to Brick, they were sitting in the room watching a movie when Ava randomly tried initiating sex. Brick kept dodging her, Ava ignored her discomfort and continued flirting with her, and made perverted comments, all while making advances. Apparently this happened shortly after a breakup, so Brick was very perplexed and engaged with Ava because Brick assumed Ava was trying to fix things, but after they finished, Ava pushed Brick off of her and refused to give any aftercare or even acknowledge Brick. Apparently, Ava went right to sleep with Brick crying on her bed. Now, it's very hard to paraphrase all of this because the details kind of develop this story. They went to the exhibition, only stayed there for 20 minutes because of high tensions. On the ride home, Brick broke down, ignoring all of Ava's apologies. Brick became nonverbal and virtually unable to move due to the mental shock. And to be fair, I don't really care about this loaded language in the document, but I'm just reading it back for you guys to come to your own conclusions. So they went back to Brick's house. Ava still trying to apologize, still being ignored by Brick due to her condition. Eventually they spoke and Brick found it in herself to get over it. Brick then states after this, Ava immediately tried to initiate again. Brick rejected the advances because they were friends. Ava decided to ask her out, said she loved Brick and wanted to be with her. Brick let herself believe Ava was being genuine, and they ended up having intercourse again. Ava left after a few hours, then broke up with Brick again during her ride home, and made it clear to her that the only reason she apologized was to get intercourse again. If I were to believe this at face value, it would be my opinion that Ava is a very gross, manipulative individual that at this point has shown somewhat of a pattern of behavior to heavily suggest that. However, whether this is actually how these events went down is difficult to say because there's very limited context, and it's hard to assess the dynamics at hand here through DMs alone. But I will point out some DMs she attached here. In these two screenshots, we'd see that Brick is still very upset about the interaction, stating that she didn't want to engage in intercourse. Ava then says, "That's why I want it to be slow," which is strange because Ava doesn't have a definition of slow in this case. In the second screenshot, though, Ava says taking it slow is taking it slow, less talking, less everything, which in my opinion, I find pretty backwards, seeing as within almost every context I know of, taking it slow would typically imply to have more communication and less intimacy. That's just my understanding. So Ava comes across as very bob and weavy here, being selective with the things that benefit her only. There's the screenshot here that stood out to me where Brick expresses her concerns of being used. However, Ava can't really seem to explain why she does the things she does, so it's very difficult to measure to what extent she's being manipulative. Brick then says that this happened twice without her initiating, and obviously point out the issue with that, with Ava acknowledging that there is an issue with what's going on here, but not really expressing any remorse. The rest of the DMs are also pretty bob and weavy. I suggest you take a look at it yourselves, or again, check out my longer, unfiltered, raw coverage in the link below. I don't want to make this video too long. Now we're moving on to the last part of the document. Apparently, Ava and Brick got into a fight. Ava went into the restroom after the fight of Brick's home and began attempting to which I find to be incredibly manipulative. I'm going to take this statement at face value. Brick then goes on to state that this isn't an isolated incident and that the other times she would threaten to hurt herself. One time, Brick got a note which got her panicked. She called another individual to get to Ava, only to find out that Ava was perfectly fine and chilling on the couch. Brick then says Ava deleted her messages to clean up her trail, and she provides these screenshots as corroboration. Now, based on these screenshots, I do want to say that in my opinion, there might be enough here to suggest that something did happen. I also do want to take a moment to apologize for being a bit too skeptical, as I want to be very careful to deliver this information in a way that is more impartial to avoid false statements, overreactions, exaggerations, etc. Which is why if you actually want my unfiltered opinions, I do kind of plug the VODs that I make because that's what I'm seeing in for the first time. I usually sit down and make these videos and analyze them in a much more fair way so that there isn't too much of an overreach. The last thing here that I'm going to go over is this statement from an ex-girlfriend from 3 years ago named Mika. This states that Mika dated Ava for 3 years, which could mean that these individuals were much younger, anywhere between, at least from my math, if we were to say this relationship happened before Brick's relationship, again, anywhere between 14 to 17 years of age. Mika makes it clear that there were consensual interactions between them. However, there would often be times that Mika would say no incessantly until Mika was asked enough times to say yes. Mika states she felt like she was just being used for her body. Then there's this discussion about how Ava would blame Mika for staying up late and that she'd get into trouble with her dad. I'm minding my language here so that this video doesn't get yoinked, to be clear. While you could argue that Ava does have a pattern of behavior of being a very pushy and manipulative individual, these individuals were very young at the time, which makes it incredibly difficult to measure just how harshly these behaviors can be judged. They still are somewhat very young in my opinion, leading me to believe that there is always a possibility that there could be some growth between these events and their early 20s. In my fair judgment, and this is all my opinion, I would have to agree with the idea that Ava was and probably still is a gross, manipulative, coercive person. However, when it comes to the main allegation here, it's hard to say, but you could make some arguments. That's up to your judgment though. I don't want to make any leading or dangerous statements. I won't be covering some of the additional screenshots in regards to their Twitter activity or additional statements because jokes back in 2021 when she would have been 14 hardly mean anything in the grand scheme of things. And other screenshots are a bit too one-sided to observe critically. However, everything is over on the other channel if you'd like to check that out. I do apologize for plugging that so much in videos like these, but that's all I got for today. Thank you for watching.